Hello everyone, welcome to Totally Tanked, episode 10. It is the 4th of July.
When the traitorous bastards left the colony.
Don't call our audience traitorous bastards. They don't understand this talk, Rob.
We want to start again. The colonies are great.
Happy, well, we're a colony too, but happy 4th of July to our American audience. We do love you, perhaps even because of all the terrible things that are happening these days.
Yes, we know you're suffering and we want you to feel better about things, so we're going to talk about tanks.
Yes.
Soon to be rolling down your streets.
But not this one. So we thought to celebrate the 4th of July, and particularly noting that our American audience really prefers it when we talk about American tanks, we're going to talk about a British tank.
We thought that was a little bit insane by us, but we thought, why not?
We did decide on the tank before we landed on the date.
Yes.
Yeah.
The Challenger.
The Challenger. Challenger 1 and 2, because life's too short to pick them apart.
Yeah. Even though they're totally different tanks. And
Vickers just changed the part. BAE changed the parts numbers. They are very similar tanks.
And it could have been the Cheviot or the Chieftain Mark 91 or something.
Possibly. Okay, let's talk Chieftain briefly as we talk about the development, because Challenger is the story of terrible decisions made in foolish ways that has yet produced a very effective fighting vehicle, and it makes it a really interesting story.
Mistakes were made and lessons were learned, and
some lessons were learned, others continue to be made,
and continuous improvement continues.
Yes, so in the 60s, the British had a tank called Chieftain.
And everyone quite liked the Chieftain. It was a good Cold War tank.
No, you see, this is where you're wrong. And so many people are wrong that they think Chieftain was a good tank. At Bovington 2 years ago, my young nephew said to me, because Chieftain rolled out onto the parade ground to show off its stuff. He said, "Is that a good tank?" I said, "No, it's a terrible tank." And then the announcer said, "This is a fantastic tank." And he was like, "You're lying to me."
And you said about proving him wrong.
I stand by my argument. As a British naval officer, I grant you, recently said, Chieftain was the best tank in the world if it broke down where you intended to fight.
So reliability issues is what you're saying?
Huge. Well, because it had, again, because of these terrible decision-making processes, someone in its development phase had said, let's have a dual-fuel engine. And then we'll get it built by the Leyland Company, who never made a good engine in their entire history.
No.
And then they tried to make it an engine that could run on petrol or diesel. And they succeeded to an extent in that it was an underpowered, extremely unreliable engine that in theory could use either fuel. But unlike in, say, the role-playing games we played in the 1990s, where a dual-fuel capability was really good because we had visions of running it on moonshine whiskey that we were going to make in the backwoods of Germany. This isn't a role-playing game, I hasten to add. It turned out that you could only convert it with a complete troop of Royal Engineers in a major workshop, and the process would take a minimum of 10 hours. With that troop of engineers. So not quite flicking a switch and filling it up with...
But as you said, as a bunker...
As a bunker, it was great. And one thing about Chieftain was that the armour was the end of the road for rounded metal armour. It was the final moment of steel armour, final moment of development. And it basically still looks like a tank from the future with its curves. It looks very much like a Robotech tank. So the Japanese had a lot of design ideas. So you had Chieftain, but it had a 120mm rifle cannon, which was probably, I will agree, the best in the world. The cannon was the best in the world, and the armour was quite good. It's just a shame it couldn't move anywhere.
And just remember, we're talking about 1960s technology, so yes, it had a really good gun, but it would only be as good as the manual operator putting it on target and shooting it, because there's not a lot of fire control smarts about the device. Yeah,
and there is also, by the way, if anyone's really interested, quite a good Cold War war porn Fulda Gap book called Chieftains. So if you want to do some end of the world escapism, it's got lots of chemical warfare and nuclear landmines and a crew in a Chieftain tank rumbling through Germany. So
sounds great.
Yeah,
but we're here
4 minutes in and we're still talking about the wrong tank.
We are.
Yeah, but we'll get there. So they decided they needed to replace Chieftain, and around this time, some clever lads in a place called Chobham, it is actually a village in England.
Just outside of Chobham.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Anyway, the armour was named after the town, came up with a much better way of making armour than anyone had ever come up with before.
They won't tell us what it is, though.
Yeah, some similarity, if you look closely, actually with what the Russians did with the T-70, but that wasn't widely known at the time. So it's believed there are little plates of super hard, and when I say hard, I mean that in the engineering sense, so extremely brittle as well. Ceramics or metal or ceramic metals.
They've got layers in it.
Lots and lots of different things that will disrupt a penetrator, or even a hesh or a heat, to disrupt any sort of shockwave moving through the armor, and that has a lot of huge advantages. One disadvantage is no one has yet figured out how to bend this composite armor, which is why tanks that use it are very slab-sided.
Well, no, yes, they are slab-sided, but what we're seeing when we're seeing these great big slab-sided things is a thin skin on the outside covering up the
real armor.
The real armor.
Yeah.
Right? So what we're seeing is the best they can come up with to cover up what is hiding underneath. So you're not actually seeing the Chobham armor itself.
No. And it should be noted that the modern version is actually called Dorchester, but the name Chobham has become so universal it might actually stick. But anyway.
Dorchester hasn't caught on because it's too long and it doesn't sound wary.
Chobham doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, though.
No, but it sounds more wary.
Okay. Anyway, moving on from that. They've got this slab-sided armor. They say to the Americans, hey, you should really use this. It's so much better than what you've got. And the Americans are like, we're not convinced. How come you're not using it on your tanks? Then they have a major project to try and build a new tank.
Called the MBT-80.
Yes.
Great big project of saying we're going to build a new tank of the future to fight the Cold War and get those Ruskies.
It's going to be filled with computers, and this was the problem. Filled with computers, and they're all going to talk to each other. And they were doing this in the 1970s, when computers were not what they are today,
No.
and no one actually knew how to... I'm over-exaggerating. Certainly, the British at that time could not make all these computers work all the time and talk to each other in a reliable way, and the whole project fell over, and the British said, oh bugger, we don't have any tanks that really work, and the chieftains on the British Army, the Rhine, don't really move, and this is a problem. And then... the Iranian Revolution happened, 1979.
And Vickers was just in the process of building the Shah of Iran some lovely new Chieftain version 7, I think it was, tanks.
But with a Rolls-Royce diesel engine.
Yes.
Generating 1,200, I believe, horsepower.
Yep. And still with the 120 gun. And they had all these things ready to roll off the production line and ship them over to the Shah in Iran. And suddenly... we don't really want to sell them to give them over to this new government, do we? No, let's not do that. Let's, how about we keep hold of them for a little bit and see what happens? And that's what they did. And suddenly they...
So the Kafir, I think they were being...
No, the Lion 1 and 2, Shira?
Yes, anyway, something.
Yes. But the main thing is they were built for an export market and they were better standard than what the British were using. They turned around and said, yep, look, with a few improvements, we're just going to take these ones. So they went through, rather than delivering these tanks to the Shah, or the Ayatollah, as it was at the time, they kept them in England and put a few more design improvements upon them and said, right, we're going for these. And in 1983-84, they started going to in-service use, replacing the Chieftains. And so suddenly you had the tank that wasn't designed, wasn't chosen, but it was the tank they had.
And it did have Chobham laminate armour. It had an enormous 120mm rifled gun. There was an issue with why they went with the 120mm rifled gun instead of the smooth bores that even then everyone was starting to head towards, which was that they built all this ammunition for the British Army on the Rhine to fight epic tank battle in Fulda Gap against the Soviets with, and that was rifled ammunition. And so they said, we'll keep the rifled gun, and this ongoing legacy drag is still plaguing the tank. We'll get to that. The other thing that happened was that Challenger went off to a series of war games and performed spectacularly badly. And in large part because they kept sending crews who weren't familiar with the tank.
Oh, they'd only rolled these ones out, gave them to the crew who hadn't used the Challenger before. They'd all been in Chieftains, and suddenly, hey, have these brand new tanks. You'll be fine with these.
Now go off to tank trials against
Everybody else.
The new Abrams and the and Leopard 2s with crews that actually knew how to fight the tank.
Yeah.
So the British will huffily say, "Oh, ours is a tank for fighting wars, not playing games." But it's like you could do okay in the games as well if you actually trained your crews in the use of the tanks. There were very similar to the Abrams before the first Gulf War. A lot of reliability concerns surrounding the tank. It seems to have turned out with both tanks that when the crews knew they were actually going to a shooting war, they started actually doing the scheduled maintenance, and all the reliability worries just disappeared.
Scheduled maintenance is expensive, and getting the parts and everything takes a long time. So
it's not entirely the crews being lazy; it's their bosses not giving them the money to do the job.
And also, you put in the requisition for parts, and they say, "Well, that'll come when it comes," right? Then there are other things the supply chain is doing. But suddenly, when you're going off to war, you get lots of parts, and that's called military logistics. And so suddenly you can actually have them there, and they can actually carry out the maintenance and fit them all with the things they're supposed to be fitted with, rather than fitted for but not with, as the saying goes.
Yeah. I have seen there's been a criticism levelled at times that British tank crews play polo. Certainly their officers do. So if only they were training in their tanks instead of playing polo, that'd be better. And I've also seen those officers respond with, we pay for those horses with our own money, so it's
cavalry officer.
It's none of your business. And secondly, we'd happily train in our tanks all year round, but we only get money to train 6 weeks of the year, so that's what we do. And the rest of the time, we're playing polo. And that seems like a fair response.
And the Geordie squad is just down the pub picking fights.
Yeah.
But
honing their tactical awareness.
So the tank itself, all right. 420 were built of the Challenger ones. It was based on the Chieftain. 62 ton tank, MBT. It can do 450 k's on road, 56 k's an hour max on road.
Now, there is one thing to note with Challenger's speed. It is a little slow because it is a heavy tank, and they say 62 tons. But that's a very dry weight, fighting weight with its reactive armour on.
For Challenger 1, I think that was the fighting weight, whereas Challenger 2, you're right.
75 to 80.
Yeah, so it's definitely 80 tonnes fully kitted out.
Yep. But because it has a very good pneumatic suspension, it can actually travel at a very high speed over rough ground in a way that a tank with a better headline top speed can't actually travel at that speed for very long.
Oh, so one of the other ones I wanted to point out is one of the reasons why they were happy to not go with other tanks, like looking at the Leopard or anything else, and just taking the Chieftain, was Maggie Thatcher was the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, and they wanted to buy Britain, and they wanted to maintain a strategic capability of building tanks.
Keeping the Vickers Company going has driven British defence procurement through the 20th century.
It's a good for a
which
nation,
is now BAE Systems, but
for a nation that wants to punch above its weight and size as a military force. Maintaining the industry to be able to do that is a very important thing. Now, our own country, Australia, has just announced lots and lots and lots of money for defence because we think, America's not going to come and look after us anymore, and China's
except we're buying American weapons that won't work if we're not being backed by the Americans. But anyway.
But the point is, they're going to have to start looking around and start saying, oh, okay, we can build warships here in Australia with everything being shipped in for overseas. But anyway, that's bigger.
You also get problems like it's relatively simple. The saying is steel is cheap and air is free to weld bits of steel together into a ship or tank shaped box. It's the systems that actually make them useful that are considerably harder to figure out. But that's
convincing people. Well, actually, convincing people to join the military after the recession that we're about to have, the depression we're about to have. Well,
I think recruiting woes are about to ease up. But okay, Challenger. Now, one thing that is worth noting: the British, having bought a tank that was designed to invade Iraq, then used it twice to invade Iraq, which was very lucky, really.
That's a really good point. They bought it, but it still didn't. Wasn't built for. Oh, sorry. What would have been shipped overseas probably would have had air conditioners and sand filters, but they didn't have that when for the British versions of them.
Yeah.
And so they had to be fitted for when they did go to Gulf War One in
Yes.
'91,
Mhm.
and they had to muck around putting on sand filters and air conditioning systems and so forth.
Now, we'll try and move the story on, but we need to talk briefly about Hesh Ammunition, because
Yes,
the reason that they keep going with this 120mm rifle gun
'cause I really like the Hesh.
with its two-part ammunition and the
Three-part.
three-part, multi-part ammunition, but yeah, I've seen different...
Maybe the Challenger one was 2-part. I don't know.
Yeah. Anyway,
Challenger two.
multi-part ammunition means that the maximum length of the penetrator probe in the discarding sabot round is significantly shorter than a single-piece round where the penetrator can go all the way through the propellant. And this is actually a problem for their use of discarding sabot ammunition. But what they do have is this Hesh round, which stands for High Explosive Squashed Head, where we have discussed it briefly before in this podcast, but basically it deforms against the object it strikes, and then sends...
Rather than penetrating.
And then it sends a shape-charged shockwave through whatever it's hit, which creates on the inside...
What they call it, a scab.
A scab of hypersonic...
Spins around inside whatever it's hitting and kills everybody.
Yeah, turns everyone into pink mist. And the neat thing about this is that within some limits of the physics, you can't make a homogeneous steel armor that will stop its interior surface being scabbed out by the shockwave. So it can penetrate enormous...
And it goes further.
Because it's rifled.
That and I don't know, but the Challenger does have the longest
world record tank on tank
kill, 5.1 kilometers.
Yes,
with a Hesh round. So,
yes, which would have been even in the very good optics of the Challenger 2, a very small dot on the screen.
Oh yeah. That was probably a very lucky shot, but it was.
They got it.
They got it. There you go. And other things with that. So with Desert War 1 in 91, in the 100 hours that the 120 British tanks were going through Kuwait and Iraq, 300 kills and no losses. They had 98% availability, so only one tank couldn't make it to the battlefield for a
Which
period
is extraordinary.
of time. Yeah, so obviously they did maintain that availability because they had all the parts they needed. So even though they were driving through the desert very fast, they still were able to carry out those things. Good, very good for tank-on-tank battles in the desert.
And also, the hydropneumatic suspension allows them to automatically track tension.
So whereas the Americans and everybody else would have to say, okay, are we driving on roads? Are we driving through off-country? Okay, we're driving off-country, then we need to slacken the tracks and make them roll a bit faster. If we're driving on roads, we need to tighten the tracks and do it so the load again.
That involves
so the operator
very large. I'm waving my arms out to their maximum length. Very large spanners.
Very large spanners.
And crew. Now, in the desert, there's not so much worry about the rain, but in Northern Europe, a lot of time in the mud, in the rain, with the whole crew wailing on the giant arm of a big spanner and a big crowbar to adjust track tension. Even if you're not changing terrain, you still need to adjust it in combat operations pretty much every day. Whereas the British press a button and the suspension...
Supposedly it's a lever. So you pull the lever and
it's by the driver, and he just moves it with his hand and it adjusts the thing.
Very good continuous improvement ideas of saying, these jobs suck. How can we change them so that they don't suck so much?
Yeah, and we talk about this a lot. You can argue that the tank crew should be tough and able to do this stuff, but there's a limit to how many things they can do in a day.
Now, I want to talk about, with that, I want to go on to, and I was going to cover it in the Challenger 2, with the tank crew stuff, and we're talking about the three-part ammunition versus your shell ammunition, which is what the standard NATO is. So it's your 120mm standard NATO shell. It's a great big 20 to 30 kilo weight. If you're the operator who has to load these suckers, you get tired after two, all right? You start getting tired. And they've actually shown that the three-part ammo, which is each part is maybe 7 kilos, you can keep that up.
Oh,
all day.
I can move. I can move 7 kilo weights much longer than I can.
You can do that all day long until you're out of your 64 rounds. Whereas your 20 to 30 kilo shell, you're not doing that nearly as fast. And so
there is an argument that there's a limit to how many shells you're going to load in any given engagement before the enemy's all dead or you're dead.
Yeah, but the point is that they've shown in trials that the 3-part ammunition is actually quicker than the shell ammunition with a loader or even with an auto loader, because the auto loaders are very fine mechanical devices, and that battlefield survivability of them is not great. So if suddenly you take a hit and your auto loader is broken, what do? You go, well, we're just going to have to go. Whereas if your operator who has to actually load the rounds gets shaken around a bit but gets up again, he just keeps on going. So it's just one of those things you say, yeah, sometimes machines are good, sometimes a person is more flexible.
Well, with machines, there's generally always an issue that they have to be calibrated and maintained, and then it becomes a question of, is it easier to calibrate and maintain it, or just get Jim Bob to stick the shell in the round? I think we've agreed in the past that the future of tanks is probably going to lie with autoloaders, but we do live in that transitional moment.
But I think it's a point of note for the Chieftain, the Challenger, that it had this, and it's shown that is a capability that is as good as and has benefits versus the shells and the autoloaders.
Yeah, and look, for all that we will mock aspects of how this tank was developed and aspects even of the tank, it remains a combat-proven tank to a degree that can't be said of pretty much any other tank in the world, except maybe the M1, and more M1s have been destroyed in far. I mean, it's arguable. Basically, no Challengers have ever been destroyed in battle,
except for one,
which was a friendly fire incident, and the hatches were open because they weren't expecting to get shot at.
Yes,
and then you get other issues with Challenger, where its belly armor was a known weakness, which is why they put reactive armor on it. And then
they figured it out now. So
when they've had lucky pot shots at the belly, because the belly's not exposed for very long, it's cresting a ridge, so
or driving over a wall.
There's a lot of RPGs flying around to actually get an RPG onto the belly of it. Now, some accounts say the driver's foot was blown off. Given that driver drove that tank back to the depot, I think that foot was injured.
He lost his foot. He didn't get blown off. Basically,
but he did keep driving the tank all the way home.
Yeah, he drove 1.5. So we'll get on. That's the Challenger 2. We'll get on to that later. Anyway,
sure.
So is there anything else we want to cover off with the Challenger 1?
Shall we do boiling vessels?
The bivvy.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So as John has pointed out many times before, the British tank is standard CES comes with a bivvy, which is a boiling vessel. A kettle inside the tank that allows you to have hot water, and at the same time it is boiling your water for your tea. You can also boil up your rations inside the kettle as well. And
the other thing that's often overlooked is it does also provide warm bathing water for the crew.
Yes. And when you're working with diesel fuel, you need tanks. Crews are allowed to have more showers because they work with diesel fuel and have to wash it off a lot more.
And again, that seems like a minor thing, but in terms of keeping the crew efficient and fighting over a long period of time,
your crew's the vital part. You can get requisition other parts, but getting trained tank crews is
and even if
time and effort.
Even if it's just having a mug of hot water to stick a flannel into and sponge bath yourself, that still leaves you feeling a lot better about sitting in your jocks in a hot, sweaty tank for 24 hours.
But they have worked on their climate control.
Yeah. Now, the boiling vessel, worth noting, after World War II, British did a major evaluation of tank losses, found out that I think it was something like 1/3 of all tanker losses were incurred while outside of the vehicle. When they investigated, it was mostly having left the vehicle to boil water for food and tea and bathing. And this is why they said, let's move that process inside the nice, safe armoured tank instead of having them lighting little fires. Also, because lighting little fires gives away your position unless you're very good with your fire lighting, which I don't imagine all of them were. Okay, so we're going to take a second. We're going to give you some sounds of the Challenger, and then we'll come back with some more. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed the sounds of the Challenger running as a very modern tank that's actually been donated to a lot of tank museums. It's one of the easier tanks in the world to see and hear. Also worth noting...
Still in use by Jordan.
And Oman.
No.
Oman's got the twos.
Twos, yes. Jordan's got the ones, and they've just fitted a automatic turret. So basically, a personless turret. Automated turret. I don't know.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's barely a Challenger at that point, you'd say. But
No.
Okay. I mean, mind you, it's worth, the South African Centurions look a lot like Challengers these days as well. But anywho. Okay, so Gulf War 1. Challenger, a bit of a surprise to everyone, is a world-class competitive battle tank.
And while they were already thinking about Challenger 2, they had to stop all that in order to focus on make sure that Challenger 1 could actually do well in the war, and that seemed to have gone pretty well.
Yeah, now it's also worth noting that Vickers, which made the original Challenger, became BAE Systems, which is sort of one of those global weapons mega conglomerates. It's still got the B for British in it, but a lot of its operations and money are American, and it competes for a lot of American weapons contracts. Now, this is why I personally think that even though they claim that Challenger 2 only has 3% parts commonality with Challenger 1...
And the naming shouldn't actually line up because they're totally different tanks, but yes, there is a similar look and feel.
The big thing with Challenger 2 is there's a sensor cluster directly above the turret, and that's probably the easiest way to spot the difference between the two, because they're otherwise very similar to look at.
Yep.
We forgot to talk. The barrel, a distinctive feature of British tank barrels since Chieftain, is that they wear stubby holders. They got little jumpers around them.
Yes.
And the reason that they need to have these thermal barrel sheaths is because the steel that they using it's a process called ESR, which is electroslag remelting, produces a very hard, very fine tolerance steel that is... they do use chrome liners, so the rifling isn't actually made out of the steel, but the rest of the barrel is. And if it gets a ray of sunshine on it, it bends. And becomes very inaccurate. So that's the reason why these British tanks have this thermal sheathing, which looks like a puffy jacket around their barrels, is so that they warm uniformly and don't bend, because they've got this very special steel.
The chromed barrels also help for maintenance, because you can they don't warp after as many shots as a steel barrel would, so they keep that so that it'll actually, you can fire more rounds without having to change the barrel out and do other maintenance with them.
And using barrel liners that came out of the warship world, but it means you're just replacing the liner, not replacing the whole gun barrel, which is saves a lot of time. Standardization of parts, it's a beautiful thing. So Challenger 2 comes out, and because they've still got all this ammunition left over from the Chieftain, they say, wouldn't it be good if we went with the Rheinmetall 120mm smoothbore like everyone else? No. Let's not do that.
That'd just be silly. We like our 120 rifled L30 barrel. Thank you very much. And we're going to stick with it. Yep. And so
they've still got the gun off the Chieftain in 2020. It's worth noting there's tiny numbers of Challenger 2s built in the global tank world. There we go, 447 built, of which I think only something like 160 are operable going forward from this time. In Britain.
They got 38 in Oman. The rest are in the English. The British have got them, and they've got 160 for training. The rest for actually part of the tank brigade.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, that's a very sensible thing to do, to have as many training tanks as real tanks.
Yeah.
Because in a real war, the training tanks just become real tanks.
Suddenly become fitted with rather than fitted for.
Yeah.
And look, let's talk about the Challenger 2. It is a very similar look, shape, feel, but
it has better systems. I grant you that.
It's more modern, basically.
And Dorchester, Block 2.
Block 2. And they looked at because the Challenger 1 was an interim tank because they wanted to get away from Chieftain. They didn't. Suddenly, they had a lot more time.
Bought the Iranians tank.
They had a lot more time to figure out what they're going to do with this. And do you know what they spent all that time figuring out what they were going to do with? How they did it? Testing. They did so much testing to figure out what works, what doesn't work for this tank, and they figured it all out, and they came up with a really good tank. Now, it entered service in '98. Fully, I mean, they've been testing for 7 years before that, going through all the various bits and pieces. But it's expected to go through till 2035. So that's a good chunk of time for a modern main battle tank. Yes, there will be continuous improvement as they change things and upgrade things and put better computers in and AI and whatever else.
Yeah, and
by having a chassis that does what it does and works well, they can do all that because they figured out this is going to work. They've got a nice big V12 Rolls-Royce engine in the back.
Yeah, but the 1,200 horsepower for an 80-ton tank is not enough.
No, but depends what you're trying. How far you're expecting to drive.
Yeah, and there is always the issue for armour that there's not much point being faster than your supply trucks.
No.
You know, and that's a cross-country speed, not an on-road speed. You know, I mean, the Indians are doing things with using the T90 chassis as the basis for everything for their armoured divisions, so that every vehicle in the division is on a T90 chassis, which means that they can all rumble across the country at the same speed, which is quite clever of them, I thought. Also, that's a really cheap chassis. But Challenger 2...
Things with the big improvement is the hunter-killer system. Now, just the name itself just is pretty cool.
It is, and it's one of those things that Russian tank YouTube videos talk about hunter-killer a lot. It just means the tank commander has his own sight, right?
But with the Challenger, that actually has the smarts in saying the tank commander can has his own turret. He can turn around in his little cupola, say, "Yep, here's the next target." So while the gunner is shooting at one target, the commander is figuring out what to shoot at next.
Yes.
Designate that as a target. As soon as the gunner pulls the trigger on or pushes the button on the first one, the turret automatically starts swinging around to the second target that the commander has designated.
Yep.
And at that time, the commander's then looking for the third target. And all this, they looked at with the Challenger, they looked at it and said, okay, what is the critical part of fighting tank battles? And
shooting first.
It's target. Where did I write it down? Anyway, it's finding the target, determining the target, putting the gun on target, figuring out the next target, putting the gun on that target, and firing at each of those. And so, cutting down the time between those, be able to designate, aim, fire, designate, aim, fire. You don't have to do them one after the other. With the commander and the gunner and the turret all acting each independently, they can each be doing it at the same time.
Yeah, which in terms of evolution of design is something that from the moment they realised that the tank commander should not be doing other jobs, and going back into World War II armour, tank commanders had to be radio operators, tank commanders had to be loaders, tank commanders had to be gunners. And there was a growing realisation that the less you asked the tank commanders to do that, the better the tank functioned. Even if you had less armour and a smaller gun and a smaller engine, you still had a better tank that did better things if you freed the tank commander up from having to do other stuff.
Yep. So, the operator who's loader is also making sure the radios are working, everything else is happening. But look, the turret on the Challenger 2, it's got a 9-second rotation.
I was about to say they are terrifyingly fast.
So that was, again, part of the decision-making process and saying, yep, we've got good armour. Once we're in a situation where lead's going down range, you want to be able to figure out what you're shooting at, get that turret on, get the gun on target, and fire, and you get on to the next target straight away. So you're always trying to beat the other person, getting guns on you.
And now, as anyone who's played a wargaming game, when I say wargaming, I mean the company, knows, be it World of Warships or World of Tanks, there's nothing in the world worse than your vehicle being able to turn faster than your turret can traverse and your turn taking your gun off target. That's a miserable moment. As you said, 9 seconds to revolve a complete revolution of the turret.
And this is a big chunk of metal is spinning around in a very fast time.
Yeah, and obviously by this stage the turret is fully basketed, so that the crew in the turret are at no risk of having their
No, they're just all standing still.
their elbows aren't sticking out while the tank spins around. Thank God, because otherwise they'd be losing a lot of body parts.
And the driver is well reclined because his head's not sticking out. If his head's sticking out, he's losing it.
It's worth noting. Sorry, going back to Chieftain, which we started, actually had the driver in a reclined position. He'd lay on his back to drive that. It was so slopey.
And so does the Challengers. He has a number of different positions that he can set his seat up in. Whereas if they're doing fine driving, like loading onto a ferry or a tank transporter or something like that, that is pretty much the only time they're driving with their heads out. Any sort of tactical movement is they are locked up inside the tank.
Because they'd lose their head.
Yeah, they would. And as soon as the turret is moving, they would lose their head. I watched a few videos where they were moving around slowly and the turret was moving slowly, and they would get banged on the side of the helmet and duck down just as the turret was moving around them. But I thought to myself, that does not look like. But supposedly it's a case of for the British, it's a rare thing to happen. Of having the turret move while the driver's hatch is open. For the Americans, from some of the comments I saw on various sections, tank sections, I said it sounded like a fairly frequent thing is that when the driver's hatch was open, his head was out, the tank commander would rotate the turret when they're not supposed to. And a few bad accidents were happening there.
You need interlocks for that sort of thing. Driver's hatch open, turret no move. Yeah. The bigger risk actually in this day and age is because there's so many tank museums springing up all over the place, because tanks are cool, is that they're being driven by enthusiasts around the track trying to show off to the adoring crowds. And I think that's where the future risk is going to lie with a lot of these systems, because that's when the driver does have his head out of the hatch.
Because it's not a tactical environment.
Anywho, and certainly Bovington, I didn't get to see Challenger when I was there, but I saw Chieftain, as I mentioned, but I know they've got them and they drive them very frequently because they can get the parts. Let's talk about beer, Rob.
Let us talk about beer. So, beer review.
Beer review. What have you brought us?
I've brought us Ursa Major American Brown from the Tall Boy and Moose Make Beer Company. Now,
disclosure, I have actually met one of the owners of Tall Boy and Moose. It was 3 a.m. After a beer festival, and we were sitting in the same booth, and the music was so loud I have no recollection of the conversation, but he seemed like a nice fella.
Was that in Melbourne?
It was in Melbourne, yes.
So I got these from the Page Bottler.
Yes, the Canberra's home of fine beer. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I went to the Page Bottler today, just before this, to see what I could find that I haven't had before.
Being
in the middle of winter, I said, right,
it is
a dark beer is what I feel like.
It's amusing to note that the Page Bottler, which is for the foreign audience, the liquor store that sells beer in the suburb of Page in the city of Canberra, has a fan page on Facebook that's called I Spent My Wage at Page, where they gush about the wonderful beers they bought there. Page Bottler, great bottle shop. If you're in Canberra, support it, because they refrigerate their stock, which is really important with craft beer. Tall Boy and Moose, so it's an American brown. So in some ways...
An Australian beer.
Yes, American being the style.
Yes.
Yep. In some ways... The beer that I made that we were drinking earlier is an American brown.
Yes.
So it's a good comparison. Very different hop profile. This is better than mine, I'll give them that. But
look, part of what grabbed me was the actual can image and what they've done with it. It's very striking by itself. You've got a great big bear ripping off somebody's arm, looking at stars going across. So Ursa Major, for those who don't know, is the bear. Yeah, the bear, the Big Dipper. And they say, when I dip, you dip, we dip. Still cold, drink fresh.
Now it's what I actually like. It's a black can that they've just put a sticker label on, a wraparound sticker label, which I think is a really good way to package small batch beers. Yeah, it's the suburb of Preston in Melbourne. I think that.
I don't think we'll get coronavirus from it.
No, I think it might be locked down though. It's close to it. But 1.8
For
standard
those
drinks.
American listeners, we have like
40 cases a day, and we're very worried about it.
like 10 suburbs have been going into lockdown. They're not allowed out otherwise they go to jail for 10 years if they leave their suburb for these 40 cases.
Look,
That is in our
let's
entire
not
country.
gloat before this whole thing's over, because things can still go wrong. It's also worth noting that while it looks a lot like some governments are failing to care for their people as we deal with this pandemic, the people in those countries don't deserve their poor governments, which is why
Some of those people are making choices.
excuse me as I cough
Into his elbow, he did it very well.
I did a COVID safe cough. Look, it's got a great lightness to it. When they see American with dark beer, they generally mean this is a really hoppy dark beer, and this delivers on that. But it's got a lightness to the hop. They've really thought this through very carefully.
And when we poured it, it had the great big head.
It's a heady boy, which I would guess say it's close to being overcarbed, but probably
Could have been the right over here.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Look, I think it's still within acceptable tolerances.
You take 2 pours for the pint glass rather than just one.
Yeah.
So it's 440 at 5.2%.
Yeah. Is it a tall boy can?
Yeah.
Yeah, 440ml. Yeah, lovely. That's perfect. Yeah, for a winter brown beer, I don't know if I'd go through a whole case of it, but could knock back a 4-pack.
I was about to say you'd be chewing, doing a lot of chewing if you're wanting to drink a case of that.
Anyway, thank you very much for bringing that around. I really enjoyed it.
As I said, it's something I haven't seen before, and it's very tasty. As I said, for a cold winter's day in Canberra, well, it's not that cold, but as with Canberra, it starts off bloody cold, and between 11 and 2:30, it's lovely, and then slowly gets cooler again as we get down to 0.
Yeah, it always makes you think it might be t-shirt weather, but it isn't actually.
No, it's not. And there's supposedly snow around the ranges come tomorrow.
Okay, let's get back
Tanks.
to the Challenger 2. Now, Wikipedia, just looking here, says it's not a Rolls-Royce engine in the Challenger 2. It's a Perkins 26 litre.
Well,
there we go.
That's not the foreign version? They were making a foreign version of the Challenger 2?
No, I think that's the main one. So the Perkins company got that. It's still, I would say, and I think even the British would admit, 1,200 horsepower is not quite enough for an 80-ton tank.
The foreign version has gone for a 1,600. Horsepower
there you go. I mean, it's worth noting, the Russians have used pretty much the same 600 horsepower tank going all the 600 horsepower diesel engine going all the way back to World War II, but their tanks are 40 tonners, not 80 tonners. So therein lies a 40 tons is a lot of difference.
Big difference. Now, my big question for these British tanks was whether or not they had a tank phone. Now, I couldn't find any evidence that they did.
And I think that would suggest they don't, because in general, when you read specs on tanks, they mention if they've got a tank phone.
And it really does sound strange, but it's such
Everyone's
a good
got mobile phones now. You just send a text message. Hey, Billy.
What if you don't know who's driving bloody call sign 14 Delta?
Well, you're meant to know these things.
And yes, everybody's supposed to have comms, but if you're an infantry person,
time after time, the capacity of any infantryman near a tank to walk up to it, pick up the phone and talk to the crew has been proven to be extremely useful.
Exactly. Rather than having, because the different chains of commands and the different radio call signs.
Having to get a call back to divisional comms and wait for them to bother to tell the tank what you want. I mean,
if you're on a certain comm line, trying to get, and you're in a certain chain of command, and you're trying to get across to another chain of command on a different comm line, it's hard. Whereas walking up to the side of the tank, picking up the phone and saying, "Hey mate, can you not run over me squad, thanks?
Yeah,
Cheers, that'd be great.
Or just move 5 meters to the left. You've got a great line of fire onto the enemy from there. And,
Whereas, trying to do all that with if you're the man on the ground, it's hard if you're using radios. Whereas getting a tank phone, and you should go up, open up the thing, and say, "How's it going? Can you just go over here? Yeah, that's fine. Don't run over us. You'll be right."
Yeah.
It's something. Whether or not they have them and they just don't list them because everybody says, "Oh, that's just standard for everybody else." But it was a question I wanted to answer and I could not find one. Now, so if anybody wants to leave comments and say yes or no, they have tank phones.
Yeah, if you know for sure, do let us know. Now, Challenger 2 achieved astonishing things. Well,
astonishing hits.
Yeah, was subjected to astonishing punishment in the occupation of Iraq. So the actual second invasion, I mean, again, the Iraqis were no more... the British actually did get bogged down in Basra, and it took a lot of hard work to fight out. It's unfair to say the Iraqis didn't fight well. The Iraqis actually caused a lot of trouble for them at the start of Gulf War II. But the overwhelming power of the Allies overwhelmed them, and then the insurgency started. And during the insurgency, there were multiple instances where Challengers were being hit with dozens of anti-armor weapons.
So whether it was the RPG-29, which is the upgraded version of the RPG-7. Which
RPG-29 is a big tandem warhead, very dangerous beast.
Milan anti-tank rockets, all sorts of things. They were getting some of them took 20, 30, even one even took up to 70.
They say 70. I know American tankers who do not believe that happened. But they say it was hit by 70. It was definitely hit by a lot. And it had thrown a track, which is why it was stationary, which is why it was taking that much fire, because it doesn't matter how confident you are in your Dorchester armour, you don't sit around if you've got a choice for that many hits.
This is street to street fighting. So basically, you got the insurgents all around them, just in various buildings and houses and everything else.
It would be very disheartening to fire 70 anti-tank missiles.
They'd taken out all. What they did do is took out all the vision slits of, so they couldn't see what they were doing. The tank crew couldn't see what they're doing because the insurgents had taken out all the. When we say insurgents, we're saying Iraqi people and all paramilitary forces. Took out all the vision slits, so the commander had no sights, the driver had no sights. They couldn't see anything, and then they drove into a ditch and looked through a track, and then they were stuck there for the next however long, until the rest of the tank platoon troop
and the recovery vehicle
could get the recovery vehicles forward to drag them out, and they did. But during that time, this tank had to sit there under constant fire from heavy machine guns, RPGs, and anti-tank missiles. And
and according to the British, and again, I'm aware of people who express some doubt about this, but according to the British, that tank, once the recovery vehicle dragged it back to the depot, put a new track on it, replaced the blocks and the vision slits, it was in action later that day.
6 hours later,
yeah.
Another thing I like about the design of it, in that sort of situation, you say, "Oh, everybody can see us and everybody can do this stuff." They actually have an ability to inject diesel onto the engine block to create smoke all around them. I think that's a great idea.
Oh, wow. I didn't know about that. Okay.
So rather than just you one-shot smoke canisters, smoke grenades that are built on the outside of the tank and just
I imagine
go off once.
the engineer corps have words to say with you when you bring a tank back in after you've done that. Yeah.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Very, very colourful language. I imagine having to clean the diesel off the burned diesel off the engine block.
It's actually a design feature. I think that's a really clever design feature of just saying, "Yep, we need a smoke screen right around the tank ourselves. Where we've fired off our smoke grenades, and we just press a button, and the diesel gets put onto the.
They basically set their
engine
on fire.
Well, it creates a plume of smoke, of diesel smoke around the tank. It obscures vision.
Yeah, right.
Other clever designs. We've talked about the reclining driver's seat. The gunner. Even in 1998, when they started rolling them out, young men had been playing video games.
Oh, it's like a PS2 controller, isn't it?
It is like a game. So the gun controller
I've actually seen a picture of it. Yeah.
it is like a games controller. So you've got your two hands beside each other in a pistol grip formation on both left and right hands. You got your thumbsticks to choose things. So it is a fixed feature inside the turret. So if the turret
it's on an arm, so it's not like they can sit with it in their lap and move it around.
But it is stationary on things. So you hold on to that. So if you get shaken around, you've got something to hold on to. Something to hold on to. You've got a steering wheel to hold on to. And you're driving with you aiming the guns and doing all the button pushes with your thumbs, just like a game controller. You got your chest pressed up against a chest pad, so you can hold yourself steady, looking through the sights, and basically you're playing whatever game you were like.
Yeah, a really terrible version of World of Tanks, but yeah.
Graphics are very good.
The resolution's terrible. It's just little dots moving around.
The range gods are giving you bad rolls all the time, so you're not doing enough damage, or it's bouncing off the rear of the T-55.
People are shouting at you way more than you used to.
But the point being, young men know how to hold and use a games controller, and so that's what they do. It used to be a pistol grip, so you would put your hand on the pistol, your right hand on the pistol grip of the gun, and you would pull a trigger.
Although, if I can.
But they don't do that anymore.
If I can take us briefly to see the fire control tables that the British used in World War I and II had a pistol grip and a trigger, which then fired the main guns. On the German fire control tables, there was a tube that they had to blow in. Wasn't in their tanks, isn't in these tanks, but I just thought people might enjoy that story.
I did. Anyway, so you got a games controller for the gunner, so he knows exactly what he's doing. And as we said, all sorts of continuous improvements to the gun sights, the tracking systems, the computer systems, the armor. The armors, again, especially a big point, whether it's putting on external armor to stop the RPGs, whether putting on reactive armor for this, that, and whatever else, or NBCD armor. Environmental projections, or they've got all these sorts of kits. And if you load them all up, they've got some great photos of the Megatron Chieftain Challenger 2, which has just everything piled on top of it, and it looks huge. It looks like twice as big as it normally is.
Yeah, and I wouldn't want to try and take it cross country with that loading on the suspension. Now, the future of the Challenger, and this is why we talked so long about Chieftain. So Chieftain was the reason they had the 120mm rifle gun. Then they had all the ammunition, so even with Challenger 2, they stuck with the 120mm rifle gun. Then they were worried they were going to finally run out of ammunition.
After Gulf War II and the invasion of Iraq, they've gone in.
Expended stores somewhat.
They've spent a lot of stores, killed a lot of Iraqi tanks, and suddenly they're going, we don't have as many rounds. And guess what? The company that makes it isn't around anymore. They're gone. So we've got no more rounds into the future for this tank.
Yes.
What do we do?
And then the funny thing is that that should have been the moment that they made the switch to the 120mm smoothbore. Worth noting, it's not a simple change of gun. It needs a whole new turret, and that basically means a whole new half of a tank. And in fact, Ryan Metal have built a 120mm smoothbore Challenger turret that they're proposing to the British.
Well, they built that for them in 2006, so I'm assuming they've done something in the last 14 years.
Yeah, they've done a few of them. Anyway, but then the British, having their tank fleet with no ammunition, have managed to find a Belgian company that will make more ammunition for it. And then
just hope they don't go to war with Belgium, I guess.
Well, yeah, there's that.
And now after Brexit, that's a possibility.
Well, yeah, but also because of the long-term contracts they've had to enter into with this company, it's looking like they're going to stick with the wrong bloody gun into the future. and wedded to what was the best tank gun in 1965.
NATO's not going anywhere. Not going to be viable soon enough, anyway.
Look, there's a whole bunch of that, but the long-term superiority, as evidenced by the fact that everyone else wants to use it, of the Rheinmetall 120mm smoothbore over the, in its day, excellent but now extremely long in the tooth.
L30 Vickers.
Yeah, 120mm rifle. it's crazy. And also, with the smoothbore, you can do things like firing anti-tank missiles out of the barrel of the tank, and all sorts of exciting things that a rifled gun won't do, because it's just less versatile. More accurate for a given round, which is why rifling was a long-term success for
That's why Sharp's rifles were able to take down Napoleon.
Well, yeah. Yeah. Anyway, so that's Challenger. An immensely successful tank for all the wrong reasons in all the wrong places, and yet
still going.
There it
and
is.
Will be going for the future.
And I would also say, if I had to choose what current tank in the world I had to go to war with, I would pick Challenger every time, because nothing's ever got through the sides.
Yep. Survivability, just going. As long as the hatches are down, you're pretty right.
Yeah, and high top speed just means you get yourself in trouble all on your own. You don't want to move up faster than everyone else.
Yeah. As long as they're not getting around behind you and blowing off the two diesel barrels on the back.
Yeah, but the big thing is proven to always bring its crews home alive. Sometimes with damage to the driver's feet that is argued about, but
they figured out the belly plate issues, and
there was an issue with the belly plate that both times that the driver's feet were injured, the reactive armor had detonated, and there's probably an argument that reactive armor over thin belly armor is a bad idea.
Right.
I actually think reactive armor, which is where the armor senses
around coming in,
and then explodes itself to disrupt that round, has always struck me as a little bit silly to blow up your own tank to save it. Obviously, it does work. Yeah, it's like backburning, I guess, but it's better not to.
But every once in a while, backburning goes really, really bad.
Yeah. Yes. So they and these armors do keep evolving and improving. And for a while, there was depleted uranium in at least the American versions.
But everybody got became politically untenable, so they've now gone for the tungsten rounds, and they've gotten rid of the uranium rounds.
Yeah, I mean, there's an issue. Depleted uranium. It's not radioactive because it's depleted, but it is insanely poisonous. Even in tiny microscopic quantities, and governments are still litigating their veterans to this day about whether or not they've suffered long-term health effects from it. And given that tungsten will do a very good job, although tungsten's extremely expensive as well, but yeah, it's not quite as exotic as depleted uranium.
No.
You can see the appeal. People like, ooh, depleted uranium, that sounds exciting.
Until you have to load the stuff and sit around it for the next 18 hours.
Or it's when you fire the stuff and have to breathe the exhaust fumes, I think, is the issue there. Anywho, I think we're done.
Thank you very much, Challenger 1, Challenger 2.
Yes, thank you, British Tank Making, for giving us such a strange story. I did note, I've seen military history people go on about, British can't make a fighting vehicle, they always stuff it up. And it's like, you made Centurion, you made Challenger, and they're like, we didn't really make either of them.
They just sort of happened.
When
When everything else went wrong, that's what we came up with. When we started thinking about it too much, then it really...
Yeah, look, all countries have disasters in defence procurement. So let's not get too hard on ourselves there.
No.
All right, thank you, folks, and we'll be back soon.
Take care, all, and stay safe and
wear masks.
Socially distanced.
Yeah.
Wear masks to save yourselves.
Mm-hmm.